The song I am playing today was actually written for Congress, right? It's a little less upbeat than most of my rock and roll,
Professor.
but yeah.
Did you hear that Senator Langford is coming to campus tomorrow?
I did not know that.
Yep.
Scott Lamar sent that.
That's a good announcement, though. You know, if you want to.
Civic engagement, baby.
That's right. If you want to go interact with your senators at the federal level, then absolutely. Senator Langford will be here. You should go talk to him. Right? Tell him what you think. Okay, so the song for today, written for Congress, a little less upbeat than my normal songs, but nonetheless, here it is.
I'm a New Yorker with long American roots. I see a land that's tilting, and I don't know what to do. Something is different, this danger feels new. Who do we look to? In the Capitol building, the chosen few. I wrote a song for you. I wrote a song for you. As you walk through Statuary Hall, do you hear the marble breathing? All the statues are trying to talk. What do you think that they're saying? The muse of history writes everything down. She writes just what she sees in Washington town. As you walk through Statuary Hall, do you catch the marble moving? All the statues are trying to walk. Where do you think that they're going? We're on a bigger team than left or right. We have a flickering history as a guiding light. Don't wanna see the American dream die in the night. Round the world in bars and parks, people commiserate. Complex feelings round this flag of ours, but don't want to see it fade. They still want their American friend. As you walk through Statuary Hall, just see the marble moving. All the statues are starting to walk. Where do you think that they're going? To find the man who would be king. Doesn't seem to care about anything. Now's the time to do something. Do we dare look away? Shut our eyes as we slide into the dark. Now's the time to do something. When we're all looking back, we will cry when we see what we have done. Now's the time to say something. Families split up, the world heating up. Now's the time to say something. We are letting hate lead us away.
Okay, so a song written for Congress and trying to kind of hit on those ideas of what I'm talking about this week, which is the fact that Congress does have the most power. But Congress is torn by this representation versus ability to govern. And so how we ask that they represent us and who it is that they represent is important. So we're going to talk about that a lot today. A quick reminder announcement. You do have a topic due for this How to Save the World policy paper. And that is due, the topic, this Friday. The paper's not due for another 2 weeks, but get that topic in this week so that your fellows have a chance to look at it and so that we have a chance to kind of respond back. I've also fielded a couple of emails. I can field more emails. Your fellows can field more emails if you're feeling a little, how do I connect this? As I said a little bit before class started, one key thing is this: the federal government, as we've discussed, funds everything. And so if we're talking about college campuses or schools or local government even, remember that a lot of their funding comes from the federal government. So you can tie these policies. Congress passes a policy that you need to do this, and if you don't get funding, or tie some funding to it. We want you to do this, so here's some money if you'll do it. Those are two different ways to use funding in that way. So I'm going to take attendance. Topic is kind of extra credit. I mean, it helps you out, right? Kind of in the same way that your thesis statement helped out. It helps you out on your paper. All right. Okay. But mainly, the most important thing, I think, is that you get some feedback before you start working. So attendance is live. There's 1 minute and 45 seconds left. Please log in, and I'm going to talk about Congress today. All right, slideshow. The first thing that we're going to talk about is congressional approval. And I want you guys to note that we are up right now from a really low period in 2014 and even in 2015, where we were down to 9%. So we have increased during that period of time, and that makes a difference, a percentage approval. For most people in the United States, when they're asked this question, they are connecting congressional approval to their perception that Congress is achieving things, creating things, right? And so basically congressional approval is going to go up if Congress is doing things, whether the majority of people agree with it or not. Congressional approval goes down when we feel like Congress is not acting. Now, I want you to look at that 84. It's a really big one. It's at the end of 2001, beginning of 2002. What is that connected to?
9/11.
9/11, Kylie, you're exactly right. So that's clearly 9/11. We have a rally around the flag effect, where if we are attacked or if we're at the beginning of a war or something like that, people really want to support the government. And so they're going to say, yeah, I approve of what they're doing. They're acting, and I approve of them. It's a rally around the flag effect. As you see, that wanes, right? As wars drag on, they become less popular. But in a time of crisis, we often see a rally around the flag effect. We see the same sort of thing here with this 39 in 2009. That's Congress enacting a big comprehensive plan to deal with the economic crisis at that time. So I think if Congress continues to enact legislation, big legislation like it has done in the last couple of months, that approval rating will actually increase. In general, however, with that exception of a few times there on that, most of us don't like Congress. The majority of people don't approve of the job that Congress is doing. But at the same time, they really like their own representatives. And we'll talk about, how representatives get reelected again and again toward the end of our lecture. But let's talk about it a little bit. One is this: House representatives in particular serve as ways that we can reach out and try to address problems that we are having with the federal government. whether that be with our veterans benefits or our Social Security benefits or our student loan problems, any of those things. Those are ways that we can reach out to our U.S. representative's office, and oftentimes they will do service to try to connect us better to those bureaucratic agencies with which we are having problems. They also communicate with their constituents, which is creating this personal bond. They have lots of high visibility on local television, but they send letters out and emails out. They show up on campus. As Jackson pointed out, Senator Lankford is going to be on campus tomorrow. They show up places, so we see them. So we get this high visibility and we feel connected to them. Part of the reason why we have such a bond with them is because they advertise. When something passes Congress that is popular, they go out there and advertise it. Obviously, the stimulus package was incredibly popular. People were very happy about that. The vast majority of people approved of it. And so members of Congress went back to their district and said, yeah, we did this. Look, we did this for you. Interestingly, no Republicans voted for it in the House, only Democrats. But even Republican representatives went home and said, look, we just passed this for you. They advertise and they claim credit for things that we like. They also position themselves in ways that are congruent with what we want. If we have expressed a public opinion in public opinion polls that this is something we like, then they position themselves there. If there's a big issue right now about education and people want a certain thing to happen, then they position themselves. And so we feel connected to them. We don't particularly like Congress, however, as a whole. And part of the reason is we expect Congress to come up with answers to our nation's problems, and we expect them to do it quickly. Like I said, one of the reasons why congressional approval is currently pretty high is that they passed some legislation relatively quickly to deal with issues that we see as our nation's problems. And so whether you agree with it or not, the action itself helps our approval of Congress. We also want them to have an open and fair policy process, and we don't think that they have one. The truth is Congress is really very transparent. We can listen in on committee meetings. We can listen to debate. We see the process from start to finish. There are exceptions on that when the leadership presents a bill, and that's kind of it. But that's actually relatively rare. I mean, it happens, don't get me wrong, but I'm saying a quick process, such as with the Patriot Act, which is this giant stack, right, of a document, that was pretty secret, but we were approving at the time, right? So it was okay. But we want this open and fair policy process. The biggest problem is most of us don't understand it. We don't understand what we can, we don't understand what it is that Congress is doing whenever it's going through the committee process, whenever it's having hearings on legislation, whenever it's marking things up. One of the things that I'm really excited about is in your labs, you're going to be spending time marking up a bill so you can think about the process. Okay, this was written by somebody outside of our group, but now we are negotiating, we're amending, and we're making that work. So we don't see it as an open and fair process. Like I said, it's actually probably the most open and fair process in the federal government. It's just hard for us to see. We want them to be effective. And so again, when they're doing something, we find that to be effective. When we don't see them passing large legislation, we don't view them as effective. And then finally, and this is probably the most important thing, we don't bond well with an institution. I mean, other than me, because I'm a weirdo and I like institutions. But for the most part, we don't bond with institutions, we bond with people, right? And so there's not a face that we put on it. We don't see it the same way. So how do members make decisions? They listen to their constituents, but they listen to their constituents primarily on salient issues. Salient. This is your vocabulary word number 1 of the day. A salient issue is something that you know about and you care about. Okay, that's what makes it salient. So I'm going to ask you guys to use your little thing on Zoom and raise your hand whenever I ask a question. Are you ready? You guys found that little place that you can do that? How many of you have an opinion about abortion? I'm watching it go up. And it's reached its kind of maximum. It's further. They start fading off after a while. But as I look at that, I'm going to tell you that's a salient issue. You have an opinion about it, and people care about that issue. It's a salient issue. So unclick your hand if you can. I think we're all down except for, there we go. Okay, we're all down. Now, how many of you have an opinion about trade with Taiwan? Six, seven, eight, nine? That's not a salient issue. It's just not. I mean, when we're talking about what the mass population cares about, trade with Taiwan doesn't rank. I'm talking to a group of people who are college educated, right? About whenever I talk about trade and Taiwan, members of Congress are not going to look to their constituents whenever they're making decisions like that. Samuel, do you have a question? Oh, okay. So, oh, my lights have just gone off. Hold on a second.
I'll just say one thing. If you say I'm here in the chat and then your name goes gray, that means you've left the Zoom, and I fix your attendance to show that you're not here. So if you're going to tell me that, please make sure you stay in the Zoom. I can see.
Thanks, Eric. So constituents are one way. They also listen to caucuses. This is groups of members of Congress who may be around a common cause. Energy producing states, there's an energy caucus. There's a peanut caucus. There's the Black caucus, the Women's caucus. There's the Hispanic caucus. There is the, there's the Timber caucus, right? So things that people have in common. They represent areas that deal with those issues, or they have characteristics that make them join those caucuses. They're going to look to their caucuses. Interest groups, absolutely. Eric, of course, has a lot of sway whenever he wears his Stop Whaling hat to important committee meetings, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so yes. Interest groups who are going to present well-researched arguments for particular bills and things like that, and they're going to pay attention to that. Colleagues, staff, their party in particular, and we talked about that on Monday, has a giant impact on how people vote. It's the number one indicator of their vote choice. But there are anomalies. So for example, when I talk about staff, usually I'm talking about members of their personal staff. They hire people and they say, hey, this is where I am ideologically. I need for you to advise me in these areas. And they hire people to do that. But sometimes it's people who are not really their staff members. There is a interesting vote record during the passage of a series of civil rights votes during the 1960s. And in that, there is a Southern representative who consistently voted against civil rights legislation, except for one time. And it was a critical one. It was one that, frankly, just won by a vote or two. His vote mattered. And it doesn't make sense. This was a really controversial one. It's really strange that he would vote for this one and not these other ones. And so political scientists, because we're curious, wanted to figure out why. And it turns out the reason is this. This member of Congress wasn't really doing his homework. He was going to the floor to vote because he voted, but he wasn't paying attention to what was being voted on. And in the elevator, he would often ask the elevator attendant, "What are we voting on today? How would I vote on that?" And the elevator attendant would tell him. He'd say, "This is how you'd vote." And so he went and voted that way. And he trusted the elevator attendant. But on this particular day, the elevator attendant knew that this would be a close vote. And as an African-American man, it made a real difference to him. And he said, "You would vote for this." And because the guy hadn't done his homework, he voted for it. And it made a difference in terms of passage of key civil rights legislation. Now, that's unusual. It's not something that really happens very often. But it's one of those little anomalies that we can see in voting records. When we talk about how individual members represent, I'm going to talk about how Congress as a whole represents, but I'm also going to talk about how individuals represent, okay? And they do so by writing legislation that would help their district or the people in their district that they perceive that would aid them. So they write this legislation, they amend this legislation, they're active on this legislation. They put together laws and policies to aid those that they represent. Another way that they might do it is through organizational service. And what that means is by serving on committees that are really beneficial and have a lot to do with their district, by serving in the leadership, and so therefore getting a little bit extra for their district as a result. It made a difference to Oklahoma that Carl Albert was Speaker of the House. When we look at Eastern Oklahoma and the amount of rural development during those years, those can be attributed to the speakership of Speaker Albert. Constituency activity. This is what I was talking about earlier. Another way they represent is to help the members in their constituency, in their district, attain federal aid, whether that be a corporation getting a particular type of help, whether it be for taxes or zoning or something like that, whether that be an individual getting their Social Security check, which went missing, whether that be someone getting their stimulus check right now, even things like writing letters of recommendation to a service academy. Those are all constituency activities. Richard Fenno was a political scientist he died very recently. And I will say that he was probably the nicest man I've ever met. Incredibly nice man. But he invented this way of doing political science research. He called it soaking and poking. Basically, he would just hang out with members of Congress and observe. He was kind of the Jane Goodall of political science research. And whenever he wrote Homestyle in 1977, he points out this important kind of idea about concentric circles of representation. By the way, I always ask questions about this on the final exam. I do. With concentric circles of representation, he finds that members of Congress represent interests of their constituencies in a descending order. They think about their constituencies first in terms of the personal, then the primary, then the re-election, and then the geographic. So I want you to think about what that means. Let's say a group of students came to me, and faculty, why not? and said, hey, Rowlett, we think you would be a great representative. We want you to run for US Congress. And I say, I don't know, all the funding, the fundraising, I'm not sure that that's something I want to do. Plus, seems hard, right? And they're like, no, you'd be great. Please do it. Please do it. And I'm like, okay, I will allow my ego to let myself do this. And so I run for Congress, okay? And I run for Congress and I win. Whenever I think about who I'm representing, the first group of people I think about are students and faculty at higher education, the University of Oklahoma specifically. But that's who I think about first. Secondly, I'm going to think about that primary constituency. Those groups of people that supported me and helped me win the primary nomination, win the nomination in my party, okay? Whether it be a Democrat or a Republican, whoever they were, okay? So let's say in this case, it was small business owners in Norman, Oklahoma. I made a connection with them. The Chamber of Commerce really supported me. Eric went to the Rotary Club on my behalf as an ambassador, right?
Mm-hmm.
Drummed up support. And so the small business community, in addition to say K through 12 educators, right? Because they saw that I was in education, they really liked it. And that's who I think about second. So whenever I'm asked to think about my district, I think about, higher ed. And then I think about small business and K through 12 education. So whenever I think about those things, I'm thinking about stuff like how it is that I see my district. The third way that I do it is through reelection. What was that 51% that put me over? Did I reach out to enough people who work at Tinker Air Force Base? Is that who I'm going to think about? So if that's who I'm teaching.
What'd you call me?
You call me. Sorry, my husband. So if I'm thinking about Tinker Air Force Base, okay, then I'm thinking about what that means in terms of my reelection. So I'm also thinking about the military now, right? And so I'm thinking about these different groups whenever I'm representing my district. Beyond that, I think about it in geographic terms. I think about what's here, right? The physical features of my district. An Air Force base, an Army base, a university, another university, an urban center, some rural farming interests. And that's how I'm going to define it next. I'm not going to define it in terms of the people that didn't vote for me. I'm going to think about it in terms of the things that are in my district. That said, I also tend to represent what I'm doing to each one of these groups the same way. I voted for this. The reason I voted for it was this. And I say the same thing, whether I am speaking at a state fair or speaking with a group of people at a faculty meeting at OU. I voted this way for this reason. I'm always going to represent my actions the same way. Finally, members of Congress, and this goes back to the idea of why do we like our member of Congress and why do we hate the institution? Members of Congress run for Congress by running against the institution. They say this, hey, look, I'm doing what I can for you, but there are 434 other yahoos up there and I have to contend with them. Congress is broken. I'm doing what I can for you. There's this great ad, and I think that I've talked about it with you guys before, from Senator Inhofe. It's from years ago. But he's walking through the wheat field, and there's an old windmill, and he sits down on the steps of a log cabin, and he says, "Send me to Washington. I'll represent Oklahoma interests. He's saying something really clear there. First of all, he's saying he hasn't been in Washington for the last 40 years, which is not true. But secondly, he's saying these are the values of Oklahoma and I represent those. Everybody else represents something else, something you don't connect to. They run for Congress by running against the institution. So this is my poll for a day. How should an elected representative official represent? And here are your three options. I'm going to talk to you about each one of them. And then I'll give you the poll. So a trustee is a representative who's elected to use their own best judgment. Imagine if you're voting for me. Do you want me to go to Congress and vote and act and to sponsor legislation and to amend legislation according to my own best judgment, based upon the fact that I'm a political science professor and I have some experience in government and I am representing this district? Or do you want me to go as a delegate, someone who votes the way that you want me to vote as a whole or as a majority, regardless of the issue, no matter what? Or do you want me to act as a politico, a trustee on those issues that are not salient, but a delegate if the issue is salient? So in other words, if it is something that the majority of people want me to vote on, want me to vote in a certain way, then you want me to vote like that. But the rest of the time, if you don't really care about it, then you don't care, right? I should vote, use my own best interest. So, and that's also, you know, if you want me to vote a certain way, even though I know that you're wrong, right? Based upon what I know of the facts. All right, I have started the poll. So you guys can answer that poll. You have 2 minutes. It is live. Trustee, delegate, or politico?
It's like those terms come back to haunt people later in the semester.
Oh, they do. That's shocking how often those particular terms show up on exams. Like a lot, a whole bunch. So I've talked to you about how members of Congress represent individually. And we've talked about this in terms of legislation and constituency service and power in the body. We've talked about how they run against Congress in those concentric circles. And we talked about delegate, trustee, and politico. Now I want to talk to you about how Congress represents as a whole, how the institution itself represents. And there are two different ways to look at this. One is descriptive representation. There's about a minute left on the poll. One is descriptive representation. The legislative body as a whole mirrors the makeup of the population. And this is important in terms of politically relevant characteristics. And what is politically relevant is going to change from era to era. We no longer think it is politically relevant that you're a farmer as opposed to a small business owner. But we do think it's politically relevant if you're a female or a male. We think it's politically relevant if you have, if you are wealthy or if you're poor. We think it's politically relevant if we're talking about our race or ethnicity. So descriptive representation, the legislative body mirrors the makeup of the population. It looks like it, right? Substantive representation is when the majority of policies, the majority of the time, reflect the desires of the population. Hannah Pitkin in 1968 looks at Congress between 1940 and 65, and she says, hey, look, Congress represents substantively. The majority of the time, the majority of the policies that they put out are what the people want. They are representing us substantively. However, Gillens and Page in 2014 looks at it between 1990 in 2012. And they find something else. They find that Congress is not representing us substantively. Rather, they find that Congress represents the wealthy and corporate interests rather than what the majority of the people want. For example, there's a recent Pew Research poll asking people if they want to raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour, and 67% of people favor that. That's a big deal, right? So if we're talking about majority of policies, this isn't a majority policy, this is one policy, but it's overwhelmingly popular. Is Congress representing substantively if they do not pass legislation in that way? It's only one policy, so you have to take it on the average, but it's a good indicator. Over the last 30 years, party has been controlled in the following ways, mostly by the, in the House, certainly mostly by the Republican Party. But the Democrats now have the control of the House again. So it's, I think it's 10-6 sessions there. In the Senate, it's a little bit more mixed. Obviously, we have another tie. We had a tie as well in the 110th. So that's 2 ties, and we had a tie in the 107th as well. The Senate is obviously a lot more tight in terms of control. And so, but at the same time, it's about 9 as far as the Republican control, and it is 7 in terms of Democratic control over the last 30 years. Let's look at descriptive representation now. I want to tell you guys what you decided. 43% want a delegate. That's much higher than it was in my other class. It was 38% there. And then trustee and Politico tied at 31% in my other class. With you guys, 27% say trustee and 29% say Politico. There's only 113 of you who are still answering polls at this point. So in terms of descriptive representation, members of Congress are more likely to be male, more likely to be older, more likely to be better educated, more likely to be white, and more likely to be rich. And we're not talking about upper middle class. We're talking about wealthy. So why does it matter? Well, one of the reasons it matters is agenda setting. And let me give you an example of that. In 1970, there was a woman who was a rancher in Nevada. She was widowed, but she owned a large ranch. She had been running it by herself for about 6 years, and she saw another tract of land adjacent to her, and she wanted to buy that and expand her ranch. She was doing well, but she was cash poor, right? I mean, land rich, cash poor. And so she went to the bank to borrow some money so she could buy this adjacent piece of land. And the bank looked at everything that she had. They looked at how profitable the ranch was. They looked at the value of the land, whether she'd be able to pay it back. And they said, this looks great. It's great. We would love to give you some money. Please bring your husband in to sign the paperwork. She said, it's only my name on this. This is all my land. And besides, my husband is dead. And they said, okay. Well, so do you have a father or a brother that you could bring in? She had to go to a different bank to get a loan. But the result of this is she ran for Congress. And she ran for Congress and requested to be put on the banking committee, specifically to sponsor legislation which prohibited discrimination in lending on the basis of sex. This passed overwhelmingly. Members of Congress said, yeah, of course. Why would we allow that? But the thing is this, and I want you guys to really remember this when we're thinking about your topic, whenever you're thinking about life in general. Other members of Congress hadn't sponsored this legislation because it wasn't a problem that they saw. You can only solve the problems you see. Your experience opens your eyes to different problems than other people see. I don't see the same things you do. Eric doesn't see the same things you do. You can only solve the problems you see. So when you're thinking about how to save the world in your topic, when you're thinking about any time in the future when you see a problem, don't assume that somebody else can solve it, because they're maybe not even seeing the problem. So agenda setting is a big reason why descriptive representation matters. It's a politically relevant characteristic because our experiences are different because of those politically relevant characteristics. Does that make sense? Now, I have another important word for you today. Second vocabulary word of the day, efficacy. Efficacy. Now, other places define it differently, but it's important that you remember how I define it. Efficacy is the connectivity between people and government. It's how connected we feel to government. Okay? If government is always them versus us, then we are not connected. If we talk about Congress like, well, you know, Congress is trying to do these things and we're working together, and then we're saying we're not saying us. If it's them, then we're not connected. Descriptive representation increases the efficacy of the public. The more that we feel that we're a part of government, the more we are a part of government. The more we participate, the more we have an impact on policies, the more government behaves like us. The less connected we are, the less government behaves that way. So, women in Congress. 51% of the population are women. 27% of Congress are women. And that's a giant leap. We had a big leap in 2018. There's also a big leap in 2020. There was also a giant leap in 1992, the year of the woman, it was called. 2018 was called the second year of the woman. And in 1992, you see the year of the woman based upon the Clarence Thomas confirmation hearings. You see women running for Congress in record numbers that year because they had seen how an all-white male Judiciary Committee put Anita Hill on trial whenever she brought forth allegations of sexual misconduct. And she didn't bring them forth. She was asked a question and she answered it. But she was clearly tried. And women said, you know, it seems like they don't get it. And women ran. In 2018, we see a response to the way that Hillary Clinton was treated during the 2016 election. And in 2020, we also see a reaction to President Trump and the way that he treated women as well. So 27% of women in the House of Representatives and 24% of women, it was 25% of women, in the Senate. It's gone down because of Kamala Harris, right? So Kamala Harris was replaced by a man from California. So 24% of women are in the Senate. There's also growing racial and ethnic diversity in Congress. And I want you to look at this. Basically, between 2001 and 2017, there were at most 2 Native Americans in Congress among the House and the Senate. Between 2001 and 2015, you have 7 to 11 that are Asian American. You have a big growth, you have a steady growth of Hispanic members of Congress in terms of ethnic diversity, right? We're almost triple between 2001 and 2021, right? So from 19 to 46. And then African-American representation has been equal to the proportion of the population since the early 1990s. And it is has kept up with that during this period of time. The Senate was a little low in terms of descriptive representation of African Americans, but the House had been descriptively representative. In terms of LGBTQ members, there are 2 senators and 9 members of the House, half of which were elected in 2018. Half of which were elected in 2018. That's significant because we're talking about, 10 to 13% of the population. Obviously, 11 out of 535 is not 10 to 13%. Now, I talked about this earlier, but I'm going to remind you about it too. Members of Congress, Mayhew is going to argue that they are single-minded seekers of re-election, that anything they do is toward the goal of being re-elected. Finno disagreed somewhat, right? He said, yeah, re-election, that's big. It's really big and it's super important. But we can tell by the way that members of Congress seek committee membership that they have other motivations, good public policy, power in the body, the ability to have that prestige. We also know that House incumbents almost always win. Over 90% of the time. Over 90% of the time. Remember, we like our members of Congress. We really like them. And they win with more than 60% of the vote. Senate incumbents win most of the time, but it's a closer margin, and it's not nearly at that 90% level. Incumbency is going to increase the chance of re-election, and it goes back to that advertising, credit claiming, and position taking that we talked about at the very beginning. Also, incumbents outspend challengers.
There's
12.
Goodbye Forever song. Loved.
Hey, Macy.
Got that one.
Okay. Also, incumbents outspend challengers 12 to 1. 12 to 1. And finally, incumbents are helped by districting or gerrymandering, the drawing of districts in such a way to include some precincts to ensure that they continue to win. The drawing of district lines by state legislatures to specifically enable members of a particular party to continue to win. Gerrymandering. All right. So that is all I have for today. James asked a question. Doesn't descriptive representation lead to substantive representation? Yeah, oftentimes it does. But it's hard to think about it that way. I mean, a lot of times people say that, oh, well, you're just looking at what people look like. But it's more than that. And that's why I wanted to point out that it makes a difference in terms of agenda setting, and it makes a difference in terms of the connectiveness of the people, right? And so that's why it's key. All right. All right. So I guess that's my only question. If you guys have other questions, please ask. If not, then until I'm going to try to drop into some of your classes this Friday afternoon, probably not in the morning, but in the afternoon. We'll see. Sorry, Eric. I might make one of yours actually, because it's so early. But I have a 10 o'clock meeting, so I know that that's going to cut out some of the morning. All right. Until then, Boomer.
Sooner. Ma'am, I had a question. You had said that Carl Albert was Speaker of the House, I believe you said.
Mm-hmm.
Speaker of the House of Representatives, right?
Yes.
And when was he that?
In the 1970s.
In the 1970s. Okay. Sorry, I didn't hear it, and I wanted to make sure I got it right.
That's why the University of Oklahoma has the Carl Albert Center. We have a repository of original papers from members of Congress. It's got this amazing library. You should actually go see it. It's in Monette Hall. On the second floor, they have the office set up, the speaker's office. He was a very tiny man, and you can always go look at it. It's in Monette Hall, second floor.
Where Monette?
Mm-hmm. It's close to, it's on the North Oval.
North Oval.
Yeah.
How do you spell Monette?
Monnetttt.
Monette Hall. Thank you. I'm not familiar with the campus, so thank you for spelling that.
Sure.
I did do a little bit of auditing of attendances today, so there may be a few mad students who
Okay.
their attendance wasn't done.
Just a quick question.
Sure.
Do we get responses from our topics that we sent in?
You should.
Like on whether it's, a good or a bad topic?
Yeah, or to expand it or to, make it more specific. You should get those responses.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, see you later.
Bye-bye.